Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to watch Historia Civilis, his year's series of this is Pompey's year, right? So we're building up on this Julius Caesar to the civil war of the Roman Empire between Pompey and his allies and Caesar and his allies. So we did his year Julius Caesar, now we're doing his year Pompey. Because I think it's good to have some backstory to the two great men, right? Original videos down below. Let's go. Okay, 56 BC.
When we last left the city of Rome, it was falling headlong into anarchy.
Yep.
The radical Senator Clodius had transformed himself into a man of the people.
Yeah, we saw that.
Through the use of street gangs, had disrupted public life in the city.
I mean, I have on my channel, I'll leave a link down below in the description of me reacting to his year Chaos, which was pretty chaotic. Like, in Rome, there was civil war between political opponents, and political opponents were either almost assassinated or they were assassinated. Their homes were destroyed and built up with temple. It was pretty chaotic. Okay.
Another senator, a conservative named Milo, had responded by raising street gangs of his own. Public life had slowly returned to normal, but at the cost of violence on the streets and political uncertainty.
Yep.
Milo, the conservative, looked to the courts to bring an end to the violence.
Makes sense.
He brought a case against Clodius, accusing him of inciting violence.
True.
Everybody knew that Clodius was guilty,
yep,
but he was able to bribe and threaten his way to a not guilty verdict.
Look at that.
As a big old middle finger to Milo, Clodius then brought an identical case against him.
Uh-oh.
Everybody knew that Milo was guilty too, but that didn't stop the Senate from running to his defense. At the trial, as Pompey was speaking on Milo's behalf, Clodius turned to his supporters in the crowd, and together they drowned out Pompey with an obnoxious chant.
I mean, it's funny, they did the same thing against, during Caesar's year, his co-consul, I don't remember his name, Bibulus? The normal civilians did the same thing when they heard him speak, right? It's pretty funny, but this looks very corrupt, right? The Senate is on Milo's side because Pompey's probably close friend or something with him, and Claudius just bribed the judiciary. I mean, that's just crazy.
Shout, "Who's starving the people to death?"
Uh-oh.
And the crowd would answer, "Pompey." They were referencing the fact that Pompey had been put in charge of Rome's grain supply.
Uh-oh.
Then Clodius would shout, "Who wants to campaign in the east?" And the crowd would answer, "Pompey."
True.
There were rumblings that the Senate was going to pick somebody to lead an army to Egypt.
Uh-oh.
And Pompey was definitely interested in the job, so that one was true. Then Clodius would shout,
although he already had conquered the east, not the southeast. He had conquered some parts of the Middle East and in Greece, I think. That's why he's the great.
Instead. And the crowd would answer, "Crassus."
Wow.
Crassus? Pompey's ally? What did he have to do with this?
Uh-oh.
There had always been unsubstantiated rumors that Crassus was secretly funding Clodius's street violence.
Right, he has to have backing.
This seemed to confirm that there was some sort of arrangement between the two men.
I mean, let's think of this. Pompey is the military genius because he was in the east and conquered lands for Rome. Crassus is the wealthy guy. And Caesar is the new up-and-coming guy. Who is he knows his politics, he knows people, he knows how to pull the strings and all that, and have connections. So it would make sense. I thought in the beginning, I didn't know anything about this, I thought Claudius was funded by Caesar. Because Claudius did some outrageous things during his year Chaos. But it makes sense that Claudius, with the amount of money he probably used to bribe the judges or whatever, right? Or the jury. Yeah, it makes sense that Crassus is behind Claudius. Makes sense. At least financial backer.
The chants soon died away, and Clodius's supporters changed tactics, spitting at Pompey. Before too long, this caused a fight, mostly because it's bad manners. In the struggle that followed, Pompey was pulled down off the speaking platform. He escaped injured. The trial was called off.
Look at that.
After the brawl, Crassus started to make a series of public speeches, arguing that the Senate should put him, and not Pompey, in charge of the yet-to-be-formalized expedition to the east. Pompey's worst fears were confirmed. The two men were coordinating. This was dangerous. Pompey privately confessed to Cicero that he feared that Crassus would send assassins after him. When it was time for candidates to declare themselves for next year's consulship, the conservatives put forward Cato's brother-in-law, a man named Domitus. If elected, he pledged to recall Caesar from Gaul and take over his command. It was in this context that Caesar summoned Pompey and Crassus to come and meet with him at what we now call the Conference of Luca. Pompey and Crassus were at each other's throats, and Caesar's command was in jeopardy. The secret alliance between these three men, the triumvirate, was splintering. Caesar's political survival depended on Domitus going down in defeat.
Makes sense.
This is when Caesar suggested that Pompey and Crassus should run against Dominus on a joint ticket. If they won, Pompey and Crassus would have the power to extend Caesar's governorship and secure prestigious governorships for themselves.
I mean, look at that. Caesar knows the political game. He knows how to pull the strings. He knows what to do. And of course, he does it for himself, but he also does it for his men. He also does it for his political allies, right? It's very corrupt, but you know.
As we know, Pompey would get Spain and Crassus would get Syria. The two men returned to Rome, with their alliance renewed.
There you go.
Around this time, Caesar sent a message to Clodius to negotiate a side deal. If Clodius would agree to throw his support behind Pompey and Crassus this year, the triumvirate would agree to support his older brother's bid for consul next year. Clodius agreed. This was an ingenious bit of politicking on Caesar's part. It was spring now, and the elections were scheduled for the summer. Pompey and Crassus immediately declared their candidacies and started campaigning. But they needed more time, so Clodius summoned his street gangs and did everything he could to disrupt public business. It worked, and the elections were postponed for the sake of public safety. But Clodius's tactics didn't make him any friends. At one point, when the Senate was scheduled to meet, a bunch of his fellow senators physically blocked Clodius from entering the building. Clodius promised that if they didn't let him in, he'd have the Senate house burned down. Yikes.
What a threat.
Summer turned to autumn and then winter.
I mean, this could backfire massively on the triumvirate. Because again, Crassus and Pompey are at sort of each other's throats. More Crassus on Pompey, but you know. And they have their little hellhound on a leash now, right? Could backfire.
Still, no elections. When the snows came in Gaul, Caesar allowed his men to travel to Rome as private citizens to vote. And so, late in the year, thousands of off-duty soldiers showed up in the city. And then, coincidentally, the street violence stopped. Elections were scheduled for January. On the last day of the year, Rome's two consuls stepped down, and there was nobody there to replace them. On the day of the election, before dawn, a group of conservatives, led by Cato and Domitus, their candidate for consul, showed up at the voting grounds. They wanted to be there early, to make sure that there was no funny business. But there was funny business. A bunch of Pompey and Crassus's supporters were already there, armed. They attacked the conservatives, killing some and driving the rest away. Apparently, Cato was wounded while defending Domitus. After the sun rose...
I mean, now you can see where all the senators got the guts to assassinate Julius Caesar. I mean, look at that. How corrupt that is. They literally they are their on the voting block and hacking their political opponents just like that. And remember, in Rome the city, I don't know the city limits, but in Rome, you can't have weapons or a military force, right? This is funny, it's like a gun-free zone. But let's think of this. In modern times, the only people who have guns in gun-free zones are the police and criminals. So the civilians are unarmed and are probably going to be victimized. In Rome, I don't think there is such a thing as the police in that sense. Maybe like streetwalkers who sort of take care of the neighborhood or whatever. But it looks like here, the only people who have weapons are political opponents, and they're technically criminals because you can't have weapons, right? That's very dangerous. Very.
Caesar's soldiers and Clodius's gang members came forward to cast their votes.
Wow.
Pompey and Crassus won their elections easily, surprising nobody. Since this election was taking place in January, the two men assumed office immediately. When elections happened, they were supposed to be overseen by consuls. This led to this weird scenario, where Pompey and Crassus were immediately responsible for overseeing the election that they had just participated in.
Yeah,
the election for Praetor happened next, and this year Cato was a candidate.
Uh-oh.
As Cato was in the process of winning his election, Pompey arbitrarily dissolved the assembly, citing bad omens. Then, after his armed thugs made their rounds, he started up the voting again. This time, weirdly, a bunch of people switched their votes, and Cato did not win.
Wow.
It was obvious to everybody what Pompey had done, and many in the crowd were upset.
I mean, let's think of this. Caesar, especially Caesar, I think, maybe Pompey as well, they were proponents of going against corruption, right? I don't know if they saw this as corruption. Maybe they only meant money as corruption or whatever, right? But this is very corrupt. How is this a legitimate election? What? You just have your thugs force people to vote, not on the person you were supposed to vote, just on another random person, just not Cato or not the conservatives, right? Even though the conservatives are the one that's sort of corrupt, in the Senate at least. I mean, everybody's probably corrupt, but that's how Caesar saw it, I think. Wow.
Then, they elected the aediles. Pompey began picking and choosing which elections were valid and which were not.
Wow.
Coincidentally, his allies got in, and everybody else had their results thrown out. This was too much for people to handle.
Yeah.
Pompey had gone mad with power. There was some pushing and shoving in the election pens.
Uh-oh.
Both factions had secretly brought weapons, and things got deadly pretty quickly.
Look at this.
At the end of the day, Pompey returned home victorious, but covered in blood. When his pregnant wife saw him, she fainted, and would later have a miscarriage.
Wow. That's a bad omen. Talk about bad omens. Wow. And I believe that's Caesar's sister. I think. I don't know the timelines here, but I think the wife of Pompey who was pregnant was Caesar's sister.
His wife, by the way, was Caesar's daughter, Julia.
Oh.
The marriage had been
arranged
years earlier to cement Caesar and Pompey's alliance through the triumvirate.
Right.
Once the dust had settled, Pompey and Crassus had an ally in the Senate introduce legislation giving 5-year governorships to Pompey and Crassus, and a 5-year extension to Caesar.
Wow.
As agreed, Pompey would get Spain, Crassus would get Syria, and Caesar would stay in Gaul.
Now this is all too common. Caesar had a goal to fight corruption. But if you've ever seen, this is a very random example, but if you ever seen the Dark Knight movie, there's the quote from Two-Face, Harvey Dent. It's like, either you fight long enough to see yourself become the villain. Or what's the quote? I don't remember the quote, but it's that you fight something. Let's say you fight corruption, but if you fight it hard enough and long enough, you are going to eventually become corrupt as well, because you're going to turn into what you were fighting, right? It's always true. I mean, a great example is the Christians during this time, during Roman times, were persecuted, killed, murdered, Jews as well. But then when Christianity became the official religion of Rome, then Christians, mostly the leaders of Christianity, they turned into the people they were fighting against originally, right? Now they were oppressing other people based on this and that, right? So you have to be careful what you're fighting, because you are going to eventually turn into what you were fighting. And this is also a great example. This is very corrupt.
But these weren't normal governorships. The legislation also gave the governors authority to unilaterally declare war without consulting the Senate. This ruffled a lot of feathers.
That sounds like the West or the US today. The last time Congress, because Congress has to approve when the US goes to war, that is what FDR had to do before going to World War II. He had to convince, I guess Woodrow Wilson had to convince even more, right, to go in World War I, right? The Congress has to approve the US going to war, and the last time I think the Congress approved to go into war was World War II, not Korea, not Vietnam, not the Middle East, right? Not South America, not Africa. But you become what you were fighting against.
But eventually the legislation passed, and their obligation to the triumvirate was fulfilled.
Wow.
And then our sources get a little patchy. But in the fall, we know that the elections were held for the year 54 BCE. Pompey and Crassus supported Clodius's older brother for consul, just as they had promised. He won his election, but so did Domitus, Cato's conservative brother-in-law that ran last year. In the winter, Crassus departed for Syria. He would not return, but we'll get to that another day.
Interesting.
Pompey decided to ignore his previous agreement with Caesar and Crassus and stay in Rome instead of going to Spain. His reasoning was this: let Crassus win victories in Syria. Let Caesar win victories in Gaul. Pompey's military career was already unparalleled.
That's
true. They called him the next Alexander the Great. He had nothing left to prove. He would stay in Rome, free from Caesar and Crassus's influence. And
I'd argue this is his undoing, though, Pompey's undoing, right? If he went to Spain, he probably would have been alive or whatever longer, right?
Established himself as the most powerful man in the city. His subordinates would govern Spain in his absence. He ended the year by throwing expensive public games. Apparently the big draw was elephant versus elephant fights, which people seemed to like.
Yeah.
The games went over pretty well, and Pompey's popularity began to rise. And then, in 54 BCE, his wife unexpectedly died in childbirth.
Yep. You can actually, in the series Rome, I think in the first season, you get, or you hear, I think Caesar read the letter he got from Pompey saying that his daughter and Pompey's wife died. And that's when the alliance started to get a little shaky. You already saw that it was shaky, but that is a very big part of why they split up.
Pompey was genuinely heartbroken and spent a good portion of the year in mourning.
Yep.
Caesar was off campaigning in Britain that summer and wouldn't learn about his daughter's death until he returned to the Gallic coast in the fall. Now, the legal bond between Pompey and Caesar was severed, and the triumvirate was back to being as fragile as ever. When the elections for that year rolled around, there was a massive corruption scandal.
Uh-oh.
All of the candidates for consul were caught bribing the consuls who would be overseeing their election. Last year, Pompey had shown everybody how easy it was to pick winners and losers,
Yep.
and everybody was interested in replicating his success. But fortunately, they were all caught before any of this could happen.
But I mean, everybody knows that they're all corrupt, right? So that they're caught, I mean, sure, it matters to the public, I guess, but everybody knows they're corrupt. But
Everybody
okay.
was disqualified, and the election was pushed back 6 months so that new candidates could be found.
Oh, I'm sure.
With violence on the streets and corrupt...
I'm sure that they pushed it back because of the corruption. It seems like there might have been a third player there who unraveled the corruption on his political opponents, and then he could have his allies get into power 6 months later. Because think of this, Pompey and Caesar and all them, Crassus, did the same scheme. They pushed the election forward, so they had more time. It seems like this is sort of what also happened. But now you're gonna have, blood and violence.
corrupt elections, Romans were feeling like the political system was becoming more and more unstable.
Yep.
People began to whisper that Pompey should step up and re-establish order. The word dictator started to be thrown around.
Yep.
Before too long, brand new candidates were campaigning for consul. One of the candidates was Milo, the conservative senator and leader of half of the city's street gangs. To Clodius, the leader of the other half of the city's street gangs, this was unacceptable.
Yep.
Clodius decided that if Milo was running, there would be no election.
Uh-oh.
He took to the streets, and Rome descended into anarchy. Clodius's gangs and Milo's gangs clashed all over the city. There were deaths every day, and corpses were just left lying openly on the streets.
Wow.
Public business ground to a halt. This continued for months, and the elections kept on being pushed back. When January 1st rolled around, there had been no elections, which meant that, again, there were no new consuls there to assume office.
Uh-oh.
One day in late January, Milo was leaving Rome on business, and just happened to meet Clodius returning to the city on the same road. Each man was flanked by armed bodyguards. The groups almost passed in peace, but two gladiators working for Milo couldn't keep their mouths shut and started taunting Clodius's men.
Uh-oh.
Fighting broke out spontaneously. In the confusion, Clodius was hit in the shoulder with a javelin. Clodius's men tried to rush him into a building, but Milo's men overpowered them.
Uh-oh.
Clodius was killed, and his body was just left on the road.
Uh-oh.
Eventually, a traveler recognized Clodius's body and had it sent to Rome. When it got to Rome, news spread of Clodius's death.
Yep, he's gonna be a martyr.
They took his body and marched toward the Forum. They had intended to hold a funeral in the Forum, but instead, the mob stormed the Senate House. They took tables, chairs, benches, and anything else that would burn, and piled it in the center of the Senate chamber. Clodius's body was laid atop the makeshift pyre, and the wood was ignited. In death, Clodius fulfilled his promise. His funeral pyre burned the Senate House down.
Look at that.
Rome's senators were horrified by this.
That's amazing.
Rome had been ungovernable for months, but if an angry mob could burn down the Senate, an angry mob could overthrow the government.
I mean, that's what it seems like, right? I don't know if that's true, though. I don't know if they were an angry mob. Maybe they were. Maybe they made, or they saw Claudius as a martyr, perhaps, right? You can see it from two angles. You can see it from a lot of angles, but you can see it from two angles. The mob saw him as a martyr, and they burned him in the Senate because he had said that he will do that, and they did that. Or they were just sympathetic and burned him pretty weird, though, in the Senate, right? But, what comes around goes around.
The whispering intensified. Dictator. The people wanted Pompey to restore order. Everybody was now taking the threat of the mob seriously, but the conservatives in the Senate had an understandable aversion to dictators.
Yeah.
So they struck a compromise. Pompey would be allowed to rule as sole consul in the year 52. This was super duper illegal. First, there had to be a 10-year gap between consulships. That was the law. Pompey had served only 3 years earlier. Second, there was no election. The Senate just decided that Pompey would be the next consul. Since when was that a thing? But nevertheless, in the year 52 BCE, Pompey assumed power.
I mean, this is very interesting. I'm learning a lot. I wonder how Caesar's gonna take that, right? Because a lot of historians and a lot of people who know about Caesar said, yeah, he was a dictator for life. Yeah, I mean, yeah, true. But what about Pompey? Was he dictator for life? I don't think so, but, you know.
When they had their consul in place, Civilis, maybe you've heard of him, put forward some legislation. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final act. This special piece of legislation gave the consuls, in this case just Pompey, unrestricted power to defend the Republic.
Wow.
It was the Roman equivalent to martial law.
Yep.
The bill passed without much debate.
Or
Pompey
Patriot Act.
immediately raised an army and had it enter the city. Just like that, Rome was under military occupation.
Yep.
Legionaries patrolled the streets, and
that's funny though, because again, that's one thing that would justify assassination on the part of Pompey, right? Because only a king would have military in Rome, because that's illegal. Already they're doing illegal things that they shouldn't do because they know that, but you know, if they support a dictator, they might get something for it, right? Very corrupt.
Fought the street gangs whenever they were found. Eventually, with soldiers on every street corner, people began to go about their daily lives again.
Okay.
As an olive branch, Pompey had Milo arrested for Clodius's murder.
Fair enough.
Milo was found guilty and was exiled from Rome. The army patrolled the streets for about a month. Peace was restored, and Pompey was the most powerful man in Rome.
Yep.
This is exactly what he wanted. Finally, Pompey had decided that the crisis had passed, and that it was time to relinquish his extra-legal authority.
Wow.
Somewhere in this period, Pompey remarried. He invited his new father-in-law, a leading conservative, to serve with him as consul for the remainder of the year.
That's cool.
Again, no election was held. They were just making it up as they went along.
Yeah.
Together, Pompey and his father-in-law passed a string of conservative reforms, such as a prohibition on candidates standing for office in absentia. This was an indirect attack on Caesar, of all people, since it would force him to give up his command early and get dragged into court over his illegal actions during his term as consul. Pompey and Caesar's alliance was broken. The triumvirate was dead. Pompey achieved his dream of becoming the most powerful man in Rome by openly abandoning Caesar's reform faction and transforming himself into the champion of the conservative cause.
As always, that was a great video. I learned a lot, and you see it is building to a civil war. Amazing. Alright, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.